We tell ourselves stories to make sense of the dark. We say the floorboards creak because the house is old. We say the wind sounds like a voice because our minds are tired. We create rational explanations because the alternative is to admit that some shadows have a weight to them. Some silences have a shape. This is the story of the shape that entered my home and the voice that spoke to my son. This is the story of Oliver and the whispering boy. It began as these things so often do, not with a bang but with a whisper. A parcel, brown paper wrapped and tied with coarse twine, arrived on our doorstep on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The postmark was from a neighboring county, and the return address was that of my Aunt, Edna, a woman whose life was curated within the walls of a venerable old house filled with the artifacts of a century. My son Leo, then 6 years old, was the one to fetch it from the step. He was intrigued by the weight of it, the solidity. Felt, he said, like a box of secrets. Inside, nestled within a bed of tissue paper that was the color of weak tea, was the doll. To call it a toy feels a misnomer. It was an effigy, a sculpture. Approximately 18 inches in height, it depicted a young boy dressed in the formal naval uniform of earlier era. A dark blue jacket with brass buttons, a peaked cap and trousers that ended just below the knee. The face was finely crafted porcelain, giving it an unsettlingly lifelike pallor, with 2 spots of rosy color high on the cheeks. But it was the eyes that commanded attention. They were not painted on. They were glass, of a deep lapis lazuli blue, and they possessed a peculiar depth, a wet sheen that seemed to capture and hold the light in a way that suggested sentience. Leo, with a child's immediate acceptance of the unusual, named it Charlie, after the faded script on the box's interior. Charterhouse and Company, Frozen Charlie, Model Number 7. He lifted it from its confinement, his small hands struggling with the weight. "He's cold, Mummy," he remarked, his brow furrowed not with distaste, but with a sort of clinical curiosity. I reached out to touch the porcelain hand. The cold was not the mild chill of a room temperature object. It was a profound, damp cold, the kind that seeps into bone. It was the cold of a church stone in winter or of soil deep in the ground. I withdrew my hand quickly, a primitive alarm sounding somewhere in the base of my brain. That first evening, Charlie was given a place of honor at the dinner table. Leo engaged him in one-sided conversation, a common enough childhood habit. Yet the topics were unusual. He asked the doll if he liked the soup or if the light was too bright. It was as if he was accommodating a guest with specific unspoken sensitivities. When I put Leo to bed, he insisted Charlie needed a pillow of his own. As I turned out the light, I heard him whisper quite distinctly, "Good night, Samuel." I paused at the door. "It's Charlie, love." His voice was sleepy but firm. "No. He says his name is Samuel." The name hung in the dark room. Samuel. It felt solid, historical, a name with weight, unlike the cheerful, informal Charlie. It was the first detail, the first crack in the facade of normality. That night, through the baby monitor on my bedside table, I heard it for the first time. A low, rhythmic sound beneath the rustle of Leo's duvet. It was too soft to be a voice, too structured to be static. It was the sound of murmuring. I told myself it was the wind, a trick of the electronics, the house settling into its foundations. But I lay awake for a long time listening to the silence that followed, a silence that now felt curiously occupied. In the days that followed, the atmosphere of our home underwent a subtle but perceptible shift. It was a change in pressure, like the static charge in the air before a storm. The central focus of this change was my son Leo. The transformation was not dramatic, but incremental, a gradual reseeding of his own vibrant personality. He began to spend long, quiet afternoons in his room, where once the space would echo with the sounds of imaginative play, the roar of dinosaurs, the clash of superheroes. Now there was only a profound listening silence. I would find him sitting on the floor, cross-legged, with the doll positioned opposite him. He wasn't playing with it, he was an audience to it. His language began to alter. He started using phrases that were archaically formal. One afternoon, after a minor spill of his juice, he looked at the liquid spreading across the table and said quite calmly, "What a dreadful waste." The word, dreadful, was not in his lexicon. The cold associated with the doll became more localized, more intense. It was no longer just the doll itself that was cold. It was the immediate space around it. If Charlie sat on the sofa, the cushion beside him would feel frigid. His presence in Leo's room dropped the temperature by several discernible degrees. My husband, a rational man and engineer by trade, joked about a drafty doll, but I saw the unease in his eyes when he felt it. The murmuring from the baby monitor intensified. It was no longer a background presence. It became a nightly ritual. I would sit in the kitchen long after everyone else had retired, a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and listen. The sound began to resolve itself not into words, but into a distinct emotional tone. It was plaintive, a recitation of sorrow. It was the sound of a child's lonely grief. Driven by a need for rational explanation, I began my research. My starting point was the name on the box, Charterhouse and Company. The company, I discovered, was a small, high-end toy manufacturer that operated for a brief period between 1910 and 1925, known for its detailed, realistic dolls. They were expensive, not the kind of thing found in every nursery. I found a catalog scan online. Model number 7, the Frozen Charlie, was listed under a special category, commemorative models. A lead. I dug deeper into forums for antique doll collectors. It was there, in a thread titled Charterhouse Mourning Dolls, that I found a passing reference that made my breath catch. A user mentioned that some of these dolls were rumored to have been commissioned by grieving families, not just as keepsakes, but as stand-ins for lost children, particularly in large institutions where individual mourning was a luxury. The phrase used was vessels for unresolved grief. And then I found him. In a digitized archive of the Blackburn and District Herald, dated February 12, 1923, was a brief, stark notice. A further funeral was held this week from the Blackburn Home for Orphaned Children, following the tragic passing of Samuel Evans, aged 7. The boy succumbed to pneumonia after a brief illness. The harsh conditions of this winter have posed a significant challenge to the home's administration. Samuel Evans. The name from Leo's lips. The date, the place, the cause of death, pneumonia, the cold, it was all there. This was no longer a story about a creepy doll. It was an intersection. My son's life had intersected with the ghost of a tragedy, a boy who died cold and alone a century ago. The whispering wasn't just noise. It was a memory replaying itself, seeking a witness. And it had chosen my son. Armed with the name, Samuel Evans, and the institution, the Blackburn Home for Orphaned Children, my unease solidified into a grim determination. This was no longer a matter of superstition. It was a historical puzzle. I became an amateur archivist, my kitchen table transforming into a command center of open laptops, scrawled notes, and printed maps of a town I had never visited. My first objective was to understand the Blackburn home. Local historical society records painted a picture of a well-intentioned but perpetually underfunded institution. It was a large, austere Victorian building, originally a private manor house, repurposed to house nearly 100 children. Photographs showed rows of expressionless young faces in identical utilitarian clothing. The conditions, according to thinly veiled reports in early 20th century newspapers, were Spartan. Discipline was strict, comforts few. The winter of 1922 to 1923 was particularly brutal. Records from the local meteorology society confirmed it was one of the coldest on record. And it was in this context that I found a more substantial article from March 1923 that made my blood run cold. It was an investigation into the home's management following the deaths of several children from respiratory illnesses. The article cited a damning testimony from a former staff member about a persistent lack of coal for the boilers and drafty dormitories with broken windows stuffed with rags. One specific detail leapt from the page, a mention of the east-facing dormitory, where a broken window pane had gone unrepaired for weeks, directly exposing the children to the elements. The cold room. Leo had spoken of a cold room. I needed to understand the doll's role in this. My research into Charterhouse and Company took a darker turn. I managed to locate a specialist in mourning artifacts at a university in London, a Dr. Alastair Finch, whom I contacted via email. I described the doll, carefully omitting the supernatural elements, framing my inquiry as a genealogical interest. Dr. Finch's response was illuminating. He confirmed that Charterhouse produced a small number of these effigy dolls for wealthy families who had lost children. However, he added a chilling postscript. There are anecdotal accounts, he wrote, of such dolls being commissioned not by families, but by the institutions themselves, particularly orphanages and workhouses, following outbreaks of disease. The rationale was both practical and psychological. A single expensive doll could serve as a focal point for communal grief, a stand-in for individual headstones they could not afford. It was a way to contain the trauma, to give a name to the nameless fear. Of course, some folklorists argue that such objects don't contain grief. They become reservoirs for it. A reservoir for trauma. The phrase echoed in my mind. Was that what we had brought into our home? A reservoir of a century-old trauma, now seeking an outlet? The final and most disturbing piece of the puzzle came from a digital scan of the home's own logbook, a document miraculously preserved in a county archive. There, in spidery, ink-faded handwriting, was an entry for January 15, 1923. It read, Evans, us. Moved to infirmary. Fever persists. Cough is troublesome. Child calls out for mother in the night. Administered soothing syrup. He called out for his mother. And now, 100 years later, through some inexplicable alchemy of sorrow and porcelain, he was calling out to mine. Knowledge, as they say, is power. But in this case, understanding Samuel's story only amplified my fear. The entity in the doll was not a demonic force. It was a ghost in the truest sense. A record of profound suffering. Yet this understanding did not lessen its threat. My son was being hollowed out, his own personality supplanted by a haunting echo. The decision to remove the doll was no longer a reactionary impulse. It was a calculated, necessary act of defense. I could not, in good conscience, destroy what was, in effect, a child's memorial. But I could attempt to return it to its context. I decided to take it to the one place that still held its history, the site of the Blackburn home. The building itself was long gone, demolished in the 1950s. In its place stood a small, unassuming public park on the outskirts of Blackburn. It felt incongruous, this cheerful space with its swings and slide, built over such a repository of sorrow. I planned the trip for a day when Leo was in school and my husband was at work. The car journey, a little over an hour, was conducted in a state of high tension. The doll, wrapped in a black cloth and placed in a canvas bag on the passenger seat, seemed to radiate a palpable cold that the car's heater could not penetrate. I spoke to it as I drove, a low, steady monologue. Samuel, I said, my eyes fixed on the road. I know your story. I know you suffered. But this has to end. You don't belong with us. You need to go back. You need to rest. I arrived at the park. It was a gray, still day. The place was deserted. I walked to the center of the park, to a small, neglected rose garden that, according to my research, was the approximate location of the old infirmary wing. The air was utterly silent. Not a bird sang. I unwrapped the doll and placed it gently on a weathered wooden bench, facing what would have been the building. The porcelain face seemed to gaze out across the lawn, the glass eyes seeing a world that was no longer there. This is where you were, I whispered. Your story is here. Not with my son. Stay here. Find your peace. I felt a fool, performing a ritual I didn't believe in for an audience I couldn't see. But as I turned to walk away, a profound sense of release washed over me. The weight I had been carrying for weeks seemed to lift. The journey home felt lighter, the air in the car warmer. For the first time in a month, I felt a flicker of hope. That evening, Leo was himself. He talked about school, about his friends, about a new cartoon he wanted to watch. He didn't mention Samuel. He didn't mention Charlie. The name never passed his lips. When I put him to bed, his room felt normal. The cold was gone. The silence was just silence. For 3 days we were a normal family again. I allowed myself to believe it was over. I had been rational, respectful, and effective. I had solved the problem. I was wrong. The return was not subtle. It was a violation. On the morning of the 4th day, I went to wake Leo for school. I opened his door and stopped dead. There, centered perfectly on his pillow, was the doll. It was not as I had left it. It was damp, as if with morning dew, and a single brownish leaf was tangled in the braided cord of its sailor suit. A faint, earthy smell of decay and wet clay clung to it. But the most terrifying change was in its expression. The slight, knowing smile was gone. The porcelain face was set in a grimace of pure anguish. The hairline crack running from its eye to its jaw seemed darker, more pronounced, like a scar that had been reopened. My carefully constructed rationality shattered. This was not a ghost. This was a poltergeist with a purpose. It had not accepted its dismissal. It had fought its way back. Leo slept on, oblivious. But that night, the phenomena escalated with a terrifying violence. It began with knocking sounds inside the walls, not the random creaks of an old house, but a deliberate rhythmic tap-tap-tapping like a child trying to get out. Then the temperature in Leo's room plummeted so drastically that his breath plumed in the air, visible in the dim nightlight. Worst of all was the voice. It no longer whispered. It spoke through Leo. My husband witnessed it this time. We were both woken by a low, guttural coughing from the monitor. A wet, painful sound. We rushed into Leo's room. He was sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His skin was icy to the touch. In a voice that was not his own, a thin, reedy voice choked with tears, he spoke. It's dark. The window's broken. I'm so cold. Mother, why won't you come? The words were a direct echo of the logbook entry. This was no longer a passive memory. It was an active possession. Samuel wasn't just telling his story, he was reliving it through my son's body. We held Leo, rubbed his arms, tried to warm him, but he was locked in that other time, that other place. After what felt like an eternity, the fit passed and he collapsed into a deep, comatose sleep. The doll we saw was now lying beside him, one porcelain hand resting on Leo's arm. The message was clear: he is mine. It was time to stop being an archivist. It was time to seek professional help. Faced with the physical manifestation of our son's distress, my husband's skepticism evaporated. We agreed on a two-pronged approach, the medical and the metaphysical. First, we took Leo to our GP, a pragmatic and kind woman. We described the symptoms: night terrors, sleepwalking, a lowered body temperature, and the episodes of disassociated speech. We did not, of course, mention the doll. She listened carefully, ordered blood tests to rule out any physiological causes, and referred us to a child psychologist, a specialist in trauma and anxiety named Dr. Sharma. The meeting with Dr. Sharma was illuminating. We described Leo's behavior, his withdrawal, his adoption of a different persona. She listened without judgment. Children, she explained, often create elaborate imaginary friends as a way to process complex emotions they can't otherwise express. Sometimes these friends can embody fears or sadness. The key is to understand what Samuel represents to Leo. Is it a fear of abandonment? A need for control? Her explanation was logical, comforting in its framework. But it couldn't account for the physical cold, the knocking, the fact that both my husband and I had heard the same archaic phrases from Leo's mouth. Modern psychology provided a map, but I feared our territory was off the edge of it. Concurrently, and with a great deal more trepidation, I sought a different kind of expert. Through a chain of discreet inquiries, I was put in contact with a man named Arthur Penhaligon, a retired professor of folklore and anthropology. I visited him in his book-crammed cottage on the Dorset coast. He was a sharp-eyed man in his 70s, with an air of having seen much and dismissed little. I told him the entire story, holding nothing back. The doll, the research, the voice, the return. He listened, steepling his fingers, his gaze fixed on me. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. You have approached this correctly, he said finally. You identified the narrative. These phenomena, they are often tied to unresolved emotional energy. A traumatic death, particularly of a child, can create a stain on a location or an object associated with it. The doll isn't haunted in the cinematic sense. It's more that it acts as a conduit, a focal point that allows this residual energy to express itself. So how do we stop it? I asked, my voice desperate. You cannot destroy a memory, he said softly. You cannot fight a story. You can only complete it. The child, Samuel, is trapped in the moment of his greatest distress. His consciousness is not at rest because his story has no ending. It simply stops in the cold and the dark. You must provide an ending. An ending. Acknowledge his pain. Validate his story. But then you must firmly and with great compassion close the book. You must tell him that his time is over. You must give him permission to leave. The love you have for your own son must become the boundary that protects him. It is the only force strong enough. I left his cottage with no simple solution, but with a new strategy. This was not a battle to be won. It was a ritual of release. The final confrontation would not be with a monster but with a lost boy. The stage was set for what I knew would be the final act. We moved Leo into our bedroom under the pretext of a fun sleepover, a ruse he accepted with sleepy excitement. His own room, now occupied only by the doll, became a chamber of intense cold. The knocking in the walls grew more frantic, more desperate. I waited until the house was silent. I did not bring a crucifix or holy water. I brought only my knowledge, my voice, and a mother's ferocious love. I entered Leo's room. The cold was breathtaking, a solid physical presence. My breath fogged in the air. The doll sat upright in the center of Leo's bed, waiting. I did not look away from its glassy eyes. I sat on the floor, putting myself at its level, and began to speak. "Samuel Evans," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I know you were 7 years old. I know you lived at the Blackburn home. I know the window in your dormitory was broken and the snow came in. I know you had a fever and a cough that hurt your chest." As I spoke, recounting the facts of his short life, the room seemed to grow even colder. The knocking in the walls ceased, replaced by an attentive, listening silence. "I know you were moved to the infirmary. I know you called out for your mother in the night. I know you were scared. I know you were lonely. And I am so sorry. No child should ever have to endure that." I poured every ounce of empathy I possessed into my words. I was no longer speaking to a thing of porcelain. I was speaking to the ghost of a child. I acknowledged his pain, his fear, his abandonment. I validated the truth of his suffering. Then I shifted my tone. It remained gentle, but it became firm, unequivocal. "But Samuel," I said, "that was a long time ago. Your pain is real and I will remember it. I will tell your story. But you have to understand, this is not your home. The boy who sleeps in the other room is my son. His name is Leo. You cannot stay here. Your body is gone. Your illness is over. The cold cannot hurt you anymore." I stood up, feeling a surge of protective energy. "You need to let go. You need to look for the light. You need to find your own mother. She is waiting for you. But you have to leave mine alone." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doll began to vibrate, a faint humming sensation I could feel through the floorboards. The air pressure in the room dropped sharply, making my ears pop. And then a sound began to form, not from the doll but from the very air around me. It was the sound of a child crying, not in fear or anger, but in a profound, heartbreaking release. It was the sound of a century of loneliness finally being acknowledged. The cold began to recede, not like a turning of a switch, but like a tide going out. The oppressive weight lifted. The crying softened, fading into a sigh and then into nothing. The room was normal. It was just a little boy's bedroom, cluttered with toys. The doll was gone. There was no flash of light, no disappearance in a puff of smoke. It had simply ceased to be. The silence that remained was not the silence of occupation. It was the silence of peace. In the weeks and months that followed, our lives slowly returned to normal. The cold was gone from the house. The whispers ceased. Leo's personality re-emerged, bright and untroubled. He had no memory of Samuel, of the whispers, or of the strange episodes. To him, the doll named Charlie was a toy he'd had briefly and then lost. We never corrected him. My husband and I did not speak of it often. The experience had left a mark on us, a shared understanding of a reality that exists just beyond the margins of the accepted world. We were closer for it, bound by a secret we would likely never share with anyone else. I kept my promise to Samuel. I compiled my research into a bound volume. The newspaper clippings, the archive photos, the history of the home. I even visited the park one last time on a bright, sunny day. I sat on the same bench and simply said, "You are remembered." Do I believe we were haunted by the ghost of Samuel Evans? I believe we encountered a powerful residual emotional imprint, a loop of trauma that found a way to express itself through the receptive, unguarded consciousness of a child. Professor Penhaligon's explanation remains the one that fits the facts most comfortably for my rational mind. But sometimes, on the coldest, clearest nights of winter, when the wind moans in a particular way through the eaves, I feel a fleeting chill. And sometimes I think I hear, just on the edge of hearing, the echo of a sigh. Not a sound of sorrow, but of relief. The past is never truly dead. It lingers in archives, in photographs, and sometimes in the porcelain face of a forgotten doll. But it only has the power we give it. We faced the shadow in the depths, not with fear but with understanding. And in doing so we found our way back to the light.